The rain poured down like nature's fury on the Grand Palace courtyard. Thomas Mitchell stood perfectly still at his post, water dripping from his ceremonial hat and soaking through his red uniform. He had been a royal guard for 15 years, and nothing had ever broken his discipline. Not the scorching summer heat, not the bitter winter cold, and certainly not this heavy downpour. The tourists huddled under umbrellas and shop awnings, pointing and laughing at the motionless figure. Some pulled out their phones to record videos, finding entertainment in his dedication to duty. Thomas could hear their whispered comments and giggles, but his training kept him focused straight ahead. "Look at that poor guy," said a young woman to her friend. "He's completely drenched but won't move an inch." Her friend smirked. "I bet we could make him crack." These guards are supposed to be unbreakable, right? What started as innocent curiosity soon turned into something darker. A group of teenagers approached Thomas, emboldened by the crowd's laughter. They began making faces at him, waving their hands inches from his nose, trying to get any reaction. Thomas remained statue-like, his eyes fixed on the distance, rainwater streaming down his face like tears. The situation escalated when one of the teenagers pulled out a small water balloon from his backpack. "Watch this," he announced loudly, drawing more attention from the growing crowd. He threw it directly at Thomas's chest, causing a loud splat. The balloon burst, adding to the water already soaking his uniform. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some laughed and cheered, while others looked uncomfortable. An elderly gentleman started to step forward but was held back by his wife, who whispered, "Don't get involved, dear." Thomas felt the impact but didn't flinch. His jaw tightened slightly, the only sign that he had registered the disrespect. His mind flashed to his training, to the oath he had taken, to the honor of his position. He thought about his daughter Sarah, who was so proud to tell her classmates that her father protected the royal family. More teenagers joined in, emboldened by the first successful throw. They had found what they thought was the perfect target, someone who couldn't fight back, couldn't defend himself, couldn't even acknowledge their existence. They began chanting and making louder jokes, turning the peaceful courtyard into a scene of mockery. A middle-aged woman in the crowd felt increasingly disturbed by what she was witnessing. She looked around, hoping someone in authority would step in, but the other guards were stationed too far away to see what was happening. The rain continued to fall, masking the tears of frustration that threatened to form in Thomas's eyes. The leader of the teenage group, a boy with bleached hair and expensive sneakers, stepped closer to Thomas. "Hey, statue man," he called out mockingly. "My little sister could do your job better than you. All you do is stand there like a decoration." The crowd's laughter grew louder and more people gathered to watch the spectacle. Some were taking photos and videos, already planning to share this moment on social media. The hashtag #StatueMan would later trend, but not in the way anyone expected. Thomas's breathing remained steady, but inside his heart was breaking. Not because of the physical discomfort or the wet clothes, but because of what this moment represented. He had dedicated his life to service, to honor, to protecting something greater than himself. Yet here he was, being treated as entertainment by people who couldn't understand the weight of duty he carried. A small girl tugged at her mother's coat. "Mommy, why are they being mean to the nice man?" Her mother knelt down and whispered, "Sometimes people don't understand what respect means, sweetheart." The child's innocent question cut through the noise of the crowd, but it was quickly drowned out by another round of laughter as someone else threw a crumpled paper ball at Thomas. It bounced off his shoulder harmlessly, but the message was clear. His dignity was being stripped away piece by piece. As the minutes ticked by, Thomas focused on his breathing, on his purpose, on the reasons he had chosen this path. He thought about the history of the Guard, the generations of men and women who had stood in this very spot, protecting the values and traditions that made their country great. He would not be the one to break that chain of honor, but deep inside something was stirring. Not anger, not revenge, but a quiet strength that had been building throughout his years of service. Thomas didn't know it yet, but this moment of ultimate disrespect would soon become the catalyst for something extraordinary. The universe has a way of balancing things out, and karma was already setting the wheels in motion. The rain continued to fall, washing away the temporary stains on his uniform but unable to cleanse the memory of this moment. Thomas Mitchell stood firm, unaware that his greatest test was about to transform into his most triumphant hour. The mockery had been going on for nearly 20 minutes when a sleek black car pulled up to the palace gates. The tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside, but the official license plate and the way other vehicles immediately gave it space suggested someone important had arrived. Thomas noticed the car from the corner of his eye but maintained his position. His training had taught him to be aware of everything around him while appearing to focus on nothing. The teenagers were too caught up in their cruel game to pay attention to the new arrival. "Let's see if we can make him blink," the bleached-haired leader announced, pulling out a small laser pointer. The crowd had grown to about 30 people now, most of them recording the harassment with their phones. The elderly gentleman who had wanted to intervene earlier looked increasingly distressed. The car door opened, and a woman in her 70s stepped out. She wore a simple navy coat and carried herself with quiet dignity. Most people in the crowd didn't recognize her immediately. She wasn't wearing the formal attire or jewelry they expected. This was exactly how Lady Margaret Hamilton preferred it. Lady Margaret was the Queen's first cousin and had served as a cultural ambassador for over 40 years. She had seen the video trending on social media just 15 minutes earlier. Someone in the crowd had already posted it with the caption, "Royal Guard gets owned by kids." She had immediately instructed her driver to take her to the palace. As she approached the crowd, Lady Margaret could see exactly what was happening. The laser pointer was now being shined directly into Thomas's eyes, causing him to squint slightly, the first crack in his composure. The teenagers cheered as if they had won a major victory. "Excuse me," Lady Margaret said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. The crowd turned to look at this unassuming elderly woman who had dared to interrupt their entertainment. The teenage leader rolled his eyes. "Move along, Grandma. We're just having some fun with the tin soldier here." Lady Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "I beg your pardon, young man. Did you just call me Grandma?" Several people in the crowd began to sense that something was different about this woman. Her accent was refined, her posture impeccable, and there was an authority in her voice that demanded attention. But the teenagers were too intoxicated by their perceived power to notice. "Yeah, I did," the boy replied with false bravado. "What are you going to do about it? Call the police?" His friends laughed, encouraging his disrespect. Lady Margaret stepped closer to Thomas, positioning herself between him and the harassment. For the first time in 20 minutes, Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. Someone was finally standing up for him. "This man," Lady Margaret announced clearly so everyone could hear, "is Guard Thomas Mitchell. He has served this country with distinction for 15 years. He has protected visiting heads of state, stood watch during times of national crisis, and represents the very best of our values." The crowd began to quiet down, sensing that this wasn't just some random passerby. The woman's knowledge of the guard's name and service record suggested she was more than she appeared. "He stands here in all weather, facing whatever the public throws at him, literally. It seems because he believes in something greater than himself. He believes in service, in honor, in duty, concepts that appear to be foreign to some of you." The teenage leader shifted uncomfortably but wasn't ready to back down. "So what, he's just a guy in a funny costume. It's not like he's actually important." Lady Margaret smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. "You're quite right that appearances can be deceiving. For instance, you might assume that I'm just an interfering old woman with nothing better to do." She reached into her purse and pulled out her identification. "I am Lady Margaret Hamilton, Special Advisor to Her Majesty. I serve on the royal household staff and report directly to the Queen about matters concerning the dignity and respect shown to our institutions." The color drained from several faces in the crowd. Phones that had been recording the harassment were quickly lowered. The teenage group suddenly looked very young and very vulnerable. "Now then," Lady Margaret continued, her voice remaining calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "let me explain what you've actually been doing here today. You haven't been having harmless fun with a tin soldier. You've been publicly humiliating a decorated serviceman while representing our country poorly to visiting tourists." She gestured to the international visitors in the crowd, some of whom looked appalled by what they had witnessed. "These people will return to their home countries with stories about how the British people treat those who serve them. Is this really the image you want to project?" The rain had stopped, but Thomas remained motionless, though Lady Margaret could sense his gratitude in the subtle relaxation of his shoulders. She had effectively created a protective barrier around him, transforming the dynamic completely. Furthermore, Lady Margaret added. Every single person who recorded this incident and posted it online has inadvertently created evidence of harassment of a public servant. Social media posts can be traced, accounts can be identified, and actions have consequences. The crowd was now completely silent except for the sound of several people frantically deleting videos from their phones. The teenage leader looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. But Lady Margaret wasn't finished. This moment had revealed something important about respect, honor, and the power of standing up for what's right. The real lesson was just beginning. Lady Margaret surveyed the now silent crowd with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades in diplomatic situations. She could see shame beginning to replace the earlier excitement on many faces. The elderly gentleman who had wanted to intervene earlier stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. "My lady," he said with a slight bow, "I should have spoken up sooner. I apologize for my cowardice." Lady Margaret's expression softened as she looked at the man. "There's no shame in hesitation, sir. But there is great honor in recognizing when we could have done better. What matters now is how we move forward." The teenage leader, whose confidence had completely evaporated, shuffled his feet nervously. His friends had already started backing away, hoping to distance themselves from the situation. But Lady Margaret wasn't done with her lesson. "Young man," she addressed him directly, "what's your name?" "Jake," he mumbled, no longer able to meet her eyes. "Jake, I want you to look at Guard Mitchell. Really look at him." Reluctantly, Jake raised his eyes to Thomas's face. For the first time, he saw past the uniform to the man underneath. Thomas's eyes, still fixed straight ahead, showed no anger or resentment. There was only quiet dignity and a strength that came from years of selfless service. "Do you see a decoration now?" Lady Margaret asked quietly. "Or do you see a human being who chose to dedicate his life to something meaningful?" Jake's throat worked as he struggled to find words. I see a person," he whispered. "Exactly. And that person has a family who loves him, dreams and fears just like you, and feelings that can be hurt just like anyone else's. The only difference is that he's chosen to put duty before comfort, service before self-interest." The small girl who had earlier asked her mother about the meanness tugged free and walked up to Lady Margaret. "Can I say sorry to the nice man?" she asked in her clear, innocent voice. Lady Margaret smiled genuinely for the first time since arriving. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. But remember, he can't respond while he's on duty. That doesn't mean he won't hear you." The little girl stepped in front of Thomas and looked up at his face. "I'm sorry people were mean to you, mister. You're very brave to stand in the rain like that. My daddy says brave people make the world safer for everyone." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, the briefest moment of warmth before he regained his composure. But everyone watching caught it, and suddenly the man behind the uniform became completely real to them. The little girl's mother approached and gently took her daughter's hand. "Thank you, Lady Margaret," she said quietly. "This has been an important lesson for all of us." One by one, other members of the crowd began to step forward. Not to apologize to Thomas directly, they understood he couldn't break protocol, but to acknowledge what had happened. "I shared one of those videos," admitted a young woman in her 20s. "I've deleted it now. I feel terrible." "I was recording too," said a middle-aged man. "I thought it was funny, but now I realize how cruel we were being." Lady Margaret nodded approvingly. "Recognition of wrongdoing is the first step toward making things right. But mere apologies aren't enough. The question is, what will you do differently going forward?" Jake, who had been standing frozen with shame, suddenly stepped forward. His face was red and his voice shook, but he forced himself to speak. "I'm the one who started all this," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I threw the first water balloon. I called him names. I made everyone else think it was okay to treat him badly." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I don't know how to fix what I did, but I want to try." Lady Margaret studied the young man carefully. She had seen many apologies in her years of service, some genuine, some calculated. This one carried the weight of real remorse. "What do you think would be appropriate, Jake?" she asked. Jake looked at Thomas again, then at the crowd, then back at Lady Margaret. "I don't know, maybe I could learn more about what these guards actually do. Like really learn, not just make assumptions?" "That's an excellent start," Lady Margaret replied. "But I think this situation calls for something more significant, something that would demonstrate real understanding of honor and service." She paused, looking around at the assembled crowd. You see, Guard Mitchell's shift doesn't end for another 3 hours. He'll stand here through whatever weather comes, protecting this place and what it represents. But now, thanks to your actions, he'll do so with the memory of this humiliation. The weight of that reality settled over everyone present. They had taken something from this man: his dignity, his peace of mind, his ability to serve without distraction. The question was whether anything could be done to restore it. Lady Margaret had an idea, but it would require courage from everyone involved. She was about to propose something unprecedented, something that would transform this moment of shame into something extraordinary. The crowd waited, sensing that whatever came next would change them all forever. Lady Margaret looked at the assembled crowd with the expression of someone who had just made a momentous decision. The courtyard had grown quiet except for the distant sounds of London traffic and the occasional drip of water from the palace eaves. I have a proposal, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the space. Guard Mitchell will stand here for 3 more hours as duty requires, but he doesn't have to stand alone. The crowd exchanged puzzled glances. What could an elderly woman possibly be suggesting? Jake, Lady Margaret addressed the teenage leader directly. You said you wanted to learn what these guards actually do. Here's your chance. I want you to stand right there beside Guard Mitchell for the remainder of his shift. Jake's eyes widened. You want me to stand still for 3 hours? In the same position? Exactly. No talking, no moving, no checking your phone. Just stand there and experience a tiny fraction of what this man does every single day. Lady Margaret's tone was firm but not unkind. Think of it as education through experience. The other teenagers shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the kind of consequence they had expected. It seemed almost absurd. How hard could it be to just stand there? But Jake started to protest, then caught himself. The memory of his earlier cruelty was still fresh, and he could see that Lady Margaret's suggestion was more than fair. Okay, he said quietly. I'll do it. Wonderful. But there's more. Lady Margaret turned to address the wider crowd. Anyone else who participated in the harassment, anyone who recorded and shared videos, anyone who laughed and encouraged this behavior, you're all invited to join him. A murmur ran through the crowd. The young woman who had admitted to sharing a video stepped forward hesitantly. You want all of us to stand here for 3 hours? I want you to understand what respect means, Lady Margaret replied. I want you to experience discipline, dedication, and service. Most importantly, I want you to show Guard Mitchell that you recognize the value of what he does. The elderly gentleman who had felt guilty about not intervening earlier straightened his shoulders. I'll stand with him, he declared. I should have defended his honor from the beginning. The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. Can we stay too, Mommy? I want to help the nice man. Her mother looked uncertain. Sweetheart, 3 hours is a very long time for a little girl. Lady Margaret smiled warmly. Young lady, what's your name? Emma, the girl replied shyly. Emma standing guard is indeed very difficult work, but there are other ways to show respect. Would you like to help me with something special instead? Emma nodded eagerly. I'm going to arrange for some proper refreshments for all these brave people who are going to stand with Guard Mitchell. Would you help me make sure everyone stays hydrated and comfortable? Emma beamed with pride at being given such an important job. Meanwhile, more people were stepping forward to join the standing vigil. The middle-aged man who had been recording, a group of university students who had been laughing, even some tourists who felt ashamed of their passive participation. This is crazy, muttered one of Jake's friends. It's just standing around, Lady Margaret overheard him. Just standing around, she repeated thoughtfully. Is that what you think Guard Mitchell has been doing for 15 years? Just standing around? She gestured toward Thomas, who continued to maintain his perfect posture despite everything happening around him. This man has stood through blizzards and heat waves. He's maintained his post during terrorist threats and public disturbances. He's been spit at, shouted at, and today pelted with objects. Yet he remains because he understands that some things are worth enduring hardship for. The friend looked properly chastened. I didn't think of it that way. Most people don't, Lady Margaret replied. That's why this experience will be valuable. As the impromptu assembly organized itself, something remarkable began to happen. The crowd that had gathered to mock and humiliate was transforming into a group united by a common purpose. They were arranging themselves in a formation beside and behind Thomas, creating a human wall of support. Jake took his position directly next to Thomas's left side. For the first time, he was close enough to see the fine details of the uniform, the careful grooming, the absolute stillness that required incredible muscle control and mental discipline. "How long have you been standing here today?" Jake whispered, then immediately regretted breaking the silence. Thomas, of course, couldn't respond, but Lady Margaret answered from nearby. "He began his shift 4 hours ago. In the rain, without moving, without complaint." Jake felt a wave of disbelief and respect. 4 hours already and 3 more to go. His legs were already starting to feel uncomfortable after just 2 minutes. The other participants took their positions, some nervous, some determined, all beginning to understand that they had committed to something much more challenging than they had initially realized. Lady Margaret stepped back to observe the scene. What had started as a moment of cruelty and disrespect was becoming something beautiful, a demonstration of solidarity, learning, and human dignity. But the real test was just beginning. The first hour was the hardest for the volunteers. What had seemed like a simple task, just standing still, quickly revealed itself to be an exercise in mental and physical endurance that none of them had anticipated. Jake discovered muscles he didn't know he had as they began to ache from maintaining the same position. His left calf started cramping around the 30-minute mark, and he shifted slightly to relieve it, only to catch himself and force his body back into position. Beside him, Thomas remained perfectly still, showing no signs of discomfort despite having been standing for over 5 hours total. The young woman who had shared the video found herself fighting the urge to check her phone every few minutes. The silence felt oppressive at first, but gradually she began to notice things she had missed before. The architectural details of the palace, the way the light changed as clouds moved across the sky, the subtle sounds of the city that usually got lost in the noise of daily life. The elderly gentleman surprised everyone, including himself, by maintaining his position with remarkable steadiness. Years of military service in his youth had given him some preparation for this challenge, though he hadn't realized how much he remembered until now. Lady Margaret moved quietly among the standing group, offering quiet words of encouragement and ensuring that little Emma had water bottles ready for anyone who needed them. The child had taken her helper role very seriously, organizing the supplies with military precision that would have made her guard friend proud. "Look, Mommy," Emma whispered to her mother, who had joined the standing group. "Everyone is being as brave as the nice man now." As the minutes ticked by, something profound began to happen. The participants stopped thinking about their discomfort and started thinking about Thomas. They began to imagine what it must be like to do this every single day, in all weather, facing whatever the public brought to your doorstep. Jake found himself studying Thomas's face in his peripheral vision. The guard's eyes never wavered from their fixed point, but Jake could see a depth there that he had completely missed during his earlier cruelty. This wasn't a robot or a decoration. This was a man with incredible self-discipline and dedication. Around the 90-minute mark, a new group of tourists arrived at the palace. They stopped and stared at the unusual sight. Dozens of ordinary people standing in formation alongside the royal guard. Some pulled out cameras, but the energy was completely different from earlier. This felt reverent, respectful, almost sacred. "What's happening here?" asked a tourist from Germany in heavily accented English. Lady Margaret stepped forward to explain. "These people are learning about honor," she said simply. "They're experiencing what it means to serve something greater than yourself." The German tourist nodded thoughtfully and, to everyone's surprise, asked if he could join them. "In my country we have military guards too. I never thought about what they endure." Soon, other visitors were asking the same question. The standing group grew from the original harassers to include people from around the world who wanted to participate in this spontaneous lesson in respect and service. By the 2-hour mark, Jake's legs were shaking with fatigue, but something had changed in his mind. The physical discomfort had become secondary to a growing sense of purpose. He was no longer standing here as punishment. He was standing here in solidarity with a man he had wronged, but who had shown him what grace under pressure really looked like. The young woman who had shared the video was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the magnitude of what she had done. She wasn't just standing in the rain for 3 hours. She was standing in the rain for 3 hours by choice, with support, with breaks for water, with the knowledge that it would end. Thomas did this every day because it was his job, his calling, his contribution to something bigger than himself. The university students who had initially laughed at the spectacle were now whispering quietly among themselves about respect, dignity, and what it really meant to serve their country. They had come to the palace as tourists and were leaving as citizens with a deeper understanding of the sacrifices others made on their behalf. Lady Margaret watched it all with growing satisfaction. She had seen many diplomatic victories in her career, but this felt different. This wasn't about treaties or negotiations. This was about fundamental human values being rediscovered by people who had temporarily lost sight of them. Thomas, for his part, remained focused on his duty, but he was acutely aware of what was happening around him. The warmth of human solidarity was replacing the earlier chill of mockery. He could feel the respect radiating from the people standing with him, and it strengthened his resolve more than any training ever had. As they entered the final hour, everyone knew they were part of something special. What had begun as harassment had become healing. What had started as disrespect had transformed into a masterclass in human dignity. The hardest part was almost over, but the real lesson was just beginning to take root in their hearts. As the final hour approached, the atmosphere in the courtyard had transformed completely. What had started as a scene of mockery and cruelty had become something resembling a peaceful demonstration of solidarity and respect. Word had spread through social media, but this time the posts carried a very different message. "Standing with a hero at Buckingham Palace," read one tweet that was being shared thousands of times. The accompanying photo showed the diverse group of people standing shoulder to shoulder with Thomas, their faces serious and determined. News crews had begun arriving, drawn by reports of this unusual gathering. Lady Margaret spoke briefly with reporters, explaining the situation in her characteristic diplomatic way. "Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected circumstances," she told a BBC correspondent. "These people discovered today that true strength isn't about power over others. It's about the discipline to serve something greater than yourself." Jake, who had been standing for nearly 3 hours now, felt like a completely different person than the cocky teenager who had thrown that first water balloon. His legs ached terribly, his back was stiff, and he had developed a new respect for anyone who chose to endure physical discomfort for a greater purpose. But more than the physical challenge, the mental discipline required had opened his eyes. For 3 hours he had been forced to think about his actions, about respect, about what it really meant to serve others. There had been no distractions, no escape from confronting who he had been and who he wanted to become. The elderly gentleman, who had introduced himself to others as Robert, was thinking about his own son who served in the military overseas. For the first time, he truly understood what his boy faced every day. Not just the obvious dangers, but the constant weight of responsibility, the commitment to something bigger than personal comfort or convenience. The young woman, Sarah, had stopped crying, but the tear tracks on her cheeks remained. She kept thinking about how casually she had shared that video, how she had turned a human being's dedication into entertainment for her social media followers. The shame was almost unbearable, but it was a necessary pain, the kind that leads to genuine change. As tourists and locals continued to gather around the standing group, something beautiful began to happen. Instead of pointing and laughing, people were removing their hats, bowing their heads respectfully, and speaking in hushed tones. Children asked their parents questions about why all these people were standing so still, leading to conversations about honor, duty, and respect. Little Emma had become something of a celebrity herself, carefully moving among the standing participants with water bottles and encouraging words. Her innocent desire to help had evolved into a masterclass in compassion and service. Several adults commented that they were learning as much from watching her as from the standing exercise itself. With 30 minutes remaining, Lady Margaret made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I've just received word from Her Majesty's office," she said clearly so all could hear. "The Queen has been following the events here today with great interest. She has asked me to convey her personal gratitude to everyone who has participated in this demonstration of respect and solidarity." A murmur of amazement rippled through the crowd. Jake felt his knees wobble, not from fatigue this time, but from the realization that the Queen herself knew about what had happened here, knew about his transformation from tormentor to supporter. Furthermore, Lady Margaret continued, Her Majesty has requested that Guard Mitchell and all the participants in today's standing vigil be invited to a special reception next week, where she can personally thank them for this remarkable display of human dignity. The standing participants exchanged amazed glances while trying to maintain their positions. An invitation to meet the Queen. It was beyond anything they could have imagined when this day began. Thomas, hearing this news, felt a surge of emotion that nearly broke his composure. In 15 years of service, he had never imagined that his dedication would be recognized at such a level. More importantly, he realized that the humiliation he had endured had somehow become the catalyst for something extraordinary. As the final minutes ticked away, each person standing in that courtyard was changed. They had learned about physical endurance, mental discipline, and the true meaning of service. They had discovered that respect isn't just about following rules. It's about recognizing the dignity and worth of every person, especially those who sacrifice for others. The tourists and onlookers had learned too. Instead of viral videos mocking a guard, they were sharing stories of ordinary people doing something extraordinary. The hashtag #Standing with Honor was trending worldwide, inspiring similar acts of respect and solidarity at royal sites across the globe. With 5 minutes remaining, Lady Margaret stepped forward one final time. When Guard Mitchell's shift ends, she announced, he will be relieved by the next guard as always. But something has changed here today that cannot be changed back. You have all learned that true strength comes from within, that dignity cannot be taken away by others, and that the greatest honor comes from serving something bigger than yourself. The final countdown had begun, and everyone present knew they were witnessing the end of something transformative. In just a few minutes, this extraordinary lesson in human dignity would conclude, but its impact would ripple outward for years to come. At exactly 4:10 p.m., the sound of precise footsteps echoed across the courtyard. Guard Harrison approached in perfect formation, ready to relieve Thomas for the changing of the guard ceremony. The crowd that had gathered to witness the end of this extraordinary vigil fell completely silent. For the first time in 7 hours, Thomas allowed himself to shift slightly as the formal handover began. The relief guard took his position and Thomas stepped back, finally free to move after his marathon of duty and endurance. But instead of immediately leaving his post as protocol usually demanded, Thomas did something unprecedented. He turned to face the group of people who had stood with him for the past 3 hours. Jake, whose legs were trembling with exhaustion and emotion, looked directly into Thomas's eyes for the first time. What he saw there wasn't anger or resentment, but gratitude and respect. The guard nodded slightly, a small gesture that spoke volumes. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "All of you." The dam of emotion that everyone had been holding back for hours finally burst. Jake stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry," he managed to say. "I was cruel and stupid, and I treated you like you weren't even human." "I don't know how to make up for that." Thomas studied the young man's face carefully. "You just did," he replied simply. "What you've done here today, what all of you have done, means more than you can possibly know." Sarah, the young woman who had shared the video, approached hesitantly. "I put your humiliation online for entertainment. I helped turn your service into a joke. How can you forgive that?" Thomas's expression softened. "Because you learned from it. Because you stood with me when you didn't have to. Because you turned a moment of cruelty into a lesson about honor." One by one, the participants approached Thomas, offering apologies, gratitude, and newfound respect. The elderly gentleman, Robert, shook Thomas's hand firmly. "In my day, I served in the military myself," Robert said. "I should have recognized a fellow serviceman and defended your honor immediately. I'm ashamed it took me so long." "The important thing is that you did it," Thomas replied. "That's what matters." Little Emma ran up and tugged on Thomas's uniform coat. When he knelt down to her level, she threw her arms around his neck in an innocent hug that nearly brought the hardened guard to tears. "You're the bravest person I ever met," she whispered. "When I grow up, I want to be brave like you." Lady Margaret approached the group, her eyes bright with satisfaction at what had been accomplished. "Guard Mitchell," she said formally, "I will be personally recommending you for a commendation for your exemplary conduct under extremely trying circumstances. Your grace under pressure has been an inspiration to everyone here." But Thomas shook his head. With respect, my lady, the real heroes today were these people. They had the courage to admit they were wrong and the strength to stand up for what's right. That's not easy for anyone. The crowd that had gathered to watch the conclusion began to applaud. Not the mocking applause of earlier, but genuine appreciation for what they had witnessed. The sound echoed off the palace walls, a celebration of human dignity and the power of redemption. Jake pulled out his phone, but instead of recording for mockery, he asked if he could take a photo to remember this moment. "I want to show my little sister that real heroes don't wear capes," he explained. "They wear uniforms and serve others every day." The group gathered around Thomas for the photo, former tormentors now standing proudly beside the man they had learned to respect. Lady Margaret made sure that little Emma was right in front, beaming with pride at her role in the day's events. As the official ceremonies concluded and people began to disperse, something beautiful continued to happen. Contact information was exchanged, plans were made to meet again, and several participants announced their intention to learn more about supporting military and service organizations. Jake approached Lady Margaret one final time. "I meant what I said about learning more about what guards actually do. Is there some way I could volunteer or help support them?" Lady Margaret smiled warmly. "I think that can be arranged, and Jake, I suspect Guard Mitchell would be happy to be your mentor in learning about true service." Thomas nodded emphatically. "I'd be honored." Over the following weeks, the story spread around the world. Videos of the standing vigil went viral, but this time they inspired rather than mocked. Other young people began volunteering with veteran organizations. Respect for service members increased noticeably at tourist sites worldwide. Jake kept his word, volunteering with a charity that supported military families and eventually applying to join the armed forces himself. Sarah became an advocate against online bullying and the casual cruelty of social media. Robert renewed his connection with his military son and began volunteering at veterans' events. Little Emma never forgot the brave man who stood in the rain, and her parents later said that the experience shaped her understanding of courage and service in ways that would last her entire life. The reception with the Queen was everything they had hoped for, and more. Her Majesty personally thanked each participant and observed that she had rarely seen such a powerful demonstration of how ordinary people could choose to do extraordinary things. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on Thomas himself. The mockery that had threatened to break his spirit had instead led to the most meaningful moment of his career. He had learned that true honor doesn't come from avoiding humiliation. It comes from maintaining dignity in the face of it and allowing others to find their own path to redemption. The courtyard at Buckingham Palace looked the same as always the next day, with a new guard standing at attention in the familiar red uniform. But something fundamental had changed. The tourists who passed by looked a little longer, spoke a little more quietly, and understood a little more clearly that they were in the presence of someone special, someone who had chosen to serve something greater than themselves. And somewhere in London, a young man named Jake was learning to stand at attention himself, beginning his own journey toward understanding what it truly means to serve with honor.